Welcome back to Laps and Legends. Today we have a very special guest who has set the 24-hour American record on this track, and he is also one of the people that decided to put this event on. This is Nick Coury, runner, racer, and one of the owners of Aravaipa Running. Welcome, Nick, to the show.
Good to be here. Good to see you both.
All right. So Nick set the 24-hour American record back in 2021 with 173.01 miles. But before we get into that, Callie, let's talk to him about the history.
I would say before we get into that, I want to rewind a little bit and talk about the history with Desert Solstice. Can you walk us back to 2010 and just sort of talk about the inception of the event and how it all came together? The first few years were at Nardini, right? And then why the venue change?
Yeah. So the history of this event, it started basically the first I'd call it the first full real year of Aravaipa Running even existing. It's when we were just starting to make our own official events. And at the time, Jamil and I had been running ultras ourselves. The 24-hour team was always something that intrigued me. And so I ran the national championship in Cleveland, Ohio at the North Coast 24. And back then there used to be 3 auto spots instead of 1 that we have now. And I just barely, in the last 10 minutes, hit the minimum standard to even be considered for the team and got 3rd place, which set me up for Worlds, which turned out to be canceled the next year anyways, so I didn't get to go. But at the same time, Jamil and I were very equivalent in our running. We ran almost all of our ultras together at that point. And so he's like, well, if Nick's going, I want to go. But the qualifying window was closing in December that year, and there weren't any good qualifiers near us. And so we thought, well, we put on races now. And so on Desert Solstice at Nardini Manor, so Jamil could run a qualifier to go to Worlds with me in 2011. And then he just never trained and didn't even run the race anymore.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
But the race still happened. And as much as we were a fan of fixed time, we didn't think they were that interesting. But what happened to this race is this guy, Tatsunori Suzuki from Japan, and then for some reason, Joe Grant, who you probably know from races like Hard Rock, not from fixed time, were both in this race. Joe took an early lead. And then suddenly in the middle of the night, we realized Tatsunori is catching Joe and he might overtake him. And so for the last 8 hours of the race was this, they knew, because in that format, you know exactly where your competitors are. Joe trying to hold on as he had blown up and was just trying to make it to the finish. Tatsunori looking stronger and stronger, trying to chase him down. And so it came down to this nail-biting sprint at the end almost. And we were suddenly just sold, this is something special. Not just having a fixed time, but having the competitive part of it. And so after Jamil didn't run this race that we invented for him, we were well, what are we going to do with this thing? And we drew on inspiration, especially from some races actually back in the 70s. There was this race called the Tipton 100. It was a 100-mile track invitational. The cutoff was 16 hours. And they had 6 guys break 13 hours. This guy, Kevin Woodward, broke the world record both for 50 and 100 miles in the same race. It was just one of the most competitive races you've never heard of. And so drawing on that and some of the world championships, we said, we want a race like this. It's only elite runners. It is a small field. It's not aimed at letting everyone do it. It's aimed at, we want world-class performances. We want an incubator that creates these. We want people to have a great place to qualify for national teams and break records. And so 2011, we moved to the track with that as the goal, having no idea if this was going to actually work.
Cool. And 2011, JL, this comes, right? He sets the 100-mile world record for men, 50 to 54. 13:52 for 50 to 54. And then also had a handful of American records with Susanna Bond, Deborah Horn. So obviously, you want to put on a race that's attracting the best of the best, and then this happened. So after this 2011 event, was this yes, it's going to work? What were you and Jamil reacting like?
Yeah, that's kind of exactly what happened. Is we're trying to bootstrap this thing. Fixed time races, other than a few people trying to go to the 24-hour national and world championships, wasn't really a thing. There wasn't much interest. There was swelling interest in trails, but not in roads. And so we were just looking for anyone or everyone. I was scraping I think Real Endurance was a website that had like all-time lists by year. So we were just like looking for who's an athlete who ran something reasonably fast. And I can't remember what Jay had run, but it was something. And he was not a track flat runner. He was a trail runner. And I was just reaching out to anyone. And I'm like, I think you could come do well at this race. And he was interested, and he wanted to go after the 50-year-old record, or the 50-year-old age group record. And it came down to the wire there. I think he got it by like 3 minutes. So, like hours out, you're like, this guy cannot slow. He actually has to speed up a slight bit. And watching him push and hang on, it's, again, such an interesting format that, yeah, we're like, this is something special. We can actually attract these athletes. And then we just kept doing that year after year. Even like 2013, no one knew the name Zach Bitter, but there's the 50 all-time fastest 50 miles is this list out there, or was out there at the time. And again, like, he ran the fastest 50 mile that had happened since before he was born.
Wow.
He ran like a 5:12. It's Chicago Lakefront. And I didn't know who this guy was, but I reached out. I'm like, you want to run 100 miles? And he said, sure. And then he came and he broke the American 100-mile record. And that was also a special race because 10 miles out, he looked like he was going to not make it. Like, he was barely hanging on. He looked like he was so much pain. He was fading. And watching the records, I suddenly realized, even though he was like borderline for the American 100-mile record, if he could hold on and then just keep going, he would break Yannis Karos's 12-hour world record. And so I told him this at 90 miles. And it was the most incredible, like, instant flip. It suddenly went from like, he was so strained to like, he was just floating and he was flying. And the last 10 miles, like the easiest that he'd ever done. And then once he crossed the 100-mile record and knew he just had to jog out a Yannis Karos's world record, he looked even lighter. And so again, like, there's just these magical moments that it's everything we hoped, but I didn't necessarily think it would happen. And yet it's happened year after year.
Insane. And I love how it's kind of grown exactly the way that you wanted it to. And, even past your vision too, into something that's just kind of organically become this, just like you said, incubator for records. And I love that. I want to talk about Mark Rickman. He set some shorter records in 2015. He set the 20K, the 25K, the 30K, and the 2-hour American record for age 60 to 64. Then, speaking of competitive nature, 2 years later, Russell DeLapp comes in and breaks all of those age group records in 2017. So just 2 years later. I love this. The competitive nature of an athlete just never dies, no matter how old you are. Can you talk a little bit about what an age group athlete, if they want to come and set something like this, a new record, what is that vetting process like whenever someone's like, Babe Ruthing it, coming in and saying like, I want to come in and I want to set these records? What's the vetting process?
Yeah, so like, we have our kind of public published process that is on the surface straightforward, which is we have A standards. If you hit the A standard, we let you in the event. You're a world-class athlete, and you're in the race. And then there's the B standard that says you're a high enough class athlete that we're willing to give you consideration. And one of the interesting things that we maybe don't publish or talk about too much, but the like unstated goal of this event, or even really the stated goal, is like, we're trying to incubate these world-class performances. And at the end of the day, that's the goal. Like, the goal isn't to let everyone into this race or maximize the chance that someone gets to run it because they aspire to run Desert Solstice. And that's maybe not the nicest like thing to say as someone who created the race, but I think you can understand why, which is there are lots of races out there. There are lots of open entry races out there. It's not trying to be that. It's trying to be something that maximizes the chance of these high performances. And like, that's a balance of a whole lot of things, like everything from like not having too many people in the race so that the track stays relatively clear and everyone out there is running a pretty consistent pace, so you're not spending the whole time running in lane 2 or lane 3 to try to get around people. But it's also having enough people that you have people to run with. As Scott knows from last year, which is, I think, our lowest year, it's not when 7 people start and you have like 2 people out there late in the day. So it's trying to balance those. Sometimes like we focus primarily on 100-mile and 24-hour because that's the original purpose of the race. We've even considered, can we add shorter distances, and have never tackled that. But there are times when we'll let someone in that is aiming for a 100K record or something like that. And it's very much case by case, and it's usually exceptional because that's not the goal of the race, and it depends on the year and how many people we're letting in. We don't actually give particular weight to age groups, meaning kind of going with the flow of the track. You still have to be able to move with the entire group that's out there. But sometimes an age group runner, a given year, we're willing to give a shot, see how it goes, like the two cases you mentioned. And like certainly someone going at that level is probably running faster than everyone else out there. And so that's not the concern for going the flow of the track. So it's kind of a lot of factors that go in, and each year ends up being unique based on like what the field is. Like if we get more A standards earlier on and the race is filling up, we're going to be letting less people in. Other years, the field's a little thinner, usually when it coincides with like a world 24-hour or some national championships, various things can pull numbers away, and so we get to let more people in. It just really depends, but we try to balance all those factors all at once, which is a tall order.
Yeah. I mean, it is. It's such a special event, and I think of that 2015 year. I wasn't there, but I think of, okay, we have Mark Rickman setting these 60 to 64-year-old records. And at the same time, Zach Bitter was on that track setting 100K and 100-mile records. And the contrast of those two athletes and what everyone is doing on the track is really just what makes this event so special. So now we're going to dive into Nick, the athlete. Like we mentioned at the start, Nick has been here. He has set the American record for 24 hours. How many times have you been to Desert Solstice, either as a runner or as a crew or race director?
Let's see, I've run the race 4 times, 2012, 2018, 2020, and 2021. I have only crewed it once. I crewed Zach Bitter one year. And then I race directed it from the first year until like 2014. And then I've been involved behind the scenes in various capacities a few other years.
Cool. All right, well, let's talk about a few of those years. So 2018, I think this goes down as one of the most epic years at Desert Solstice for a lot of reasons. There was some world records set, but let's just focus on you. Can you kind of just walk through what happened 2018 and your performance there?
Yeah, so the 24 hours is a brutal race, and I obsessed on it for a while. And prior to that, my last 24 hours in 2013. And so I'd taken a 5-year hiatus from it, focused on more mountain runs, because sometimes it takes that long to forget. But beginning in 2018, I said, it's time to go for it again. And so I trained for almost 12 months straight preparing for that. I'd also been starting work on my hypothesis on negative splitting. And as I trained, I just decided I'm going to negative split this race and see if it's possible and see what happens. And, sure enough, it was like, I hadn't even really been doing it at races that year. I think I'd done one negative split ultra in the spring. But for whatever reason, everything came together and I ended up just barely negative splitting it, running the 16-mile PR from 139 up to 155. And just the race went almost unbelievably perfect. I think I had a small energy dip at 22 hours that I had to hang on through for reasons we'll talk about in a second. But it went way better than I thought it could. And I just I thought to make the US team based on the previous year, which was very, very competitive, I'd have to run 154 miles. And so I paced to run half of that in the first half and then hope that I could run just a little more in the second half. And just religiously ran that pace all day, all night, into the next day. As we're getting towards those final hours, I'm watching the people in front of me, and Greg Armstrong was something like 3 or 4 miles ahead of me. And I was just slowly inching closer and closer to him. And I just said, I'm going to go for it and try to catch him. Bob Hearn was right behind me, also running a very similar race. I think we were a lap apart. I don't think I saw him for 12 hours at some point because we were exactly in sync at our pace.
That's funny.
And so we were just constantly on opposite sides of the track. And so I knew he was right there. And so all of us are just locked into trying to get these final spots on the team. And so by the last half hour, I think I was down to, I think it was under 2 miles to catch Greg. And I just started pushing as hard as I could. And the fun thing about the track is he can just look and see where I'm at. So every time I put in a surge, he would try to put in a surge to hold me off. And I was slowly reeling him in until like the last couple minutes, we were on the same lap and he was doing everything he could. Like if you've seen videos after, like he wore Tiva sandals and his feet were bloody because the straps had just cut in so much. And I was just trying with everything I had to catch him. And I finished 120 meters short of catching him. And he collapsed. I think everyone collapsed out there. But I was 5th on the team in terms of the standings. And so I wasn't that disappointed because both of us had spots on the team. Except, and that was supposed to be the last qualifier, except then because Worlds like got moved later, they opened the qualifying window and I ended up getting bumped to the alternate. So only after did I know that was the difference between being on the team or not.
Wow, half a lap.
That's when you start thinking back to like all those little moments that could have been different, and you just can't put yourself in that situation. But half a lap, oh my gosh.
And
that's
then
200 meters.
And then 2020, I was on the track for this. And I know this is, kind of like helped shape your career. Talk about that battle with Ryan Montgomery and what happened there.
So I will start actually with Callie's comment first, because this is all I could think after 2018. So like those of you who have followed the things that I do in 24 hours now happened because I was 120 meters behind Greg, and all I can think is that is one pee break. That
yeah,
is
literally
to tie your shoe. Like that is one single little thing you wouldn't think twice about. Just made the difference between me making or not making the US team. And so for the next like 2 years, all I did is think about like I've optimized all the broad strokes over the last several years. And I figured out pacing, I figured out nutrition, I figured out like all these big critical things. I now have to go into these fine details that usually aren't worth obsessing on, but I'm going to go obsess on every single one of them. And so leading into 2020, that's a lot of what I was working on are like, where can I save 10 seconds? Where can I save 20 seconds? Where can I save a fraction of a second, every hour, which adds up to, 30 seconds. And just trying to refine more and more of those things and practice them in races and get them so they just become muscle memory. And I'm going to try to go for a much bigger number. And I don't even remember if I had a specific target number other than I wanted a negative split again. I think I was shooting for like mid to high 160s. And it was going well until it wasn't. And I think that was something like 18 hours in. But I had taken the lead. I had set a pretty big lead. And then suddenly just everything started falling apart. Like my quads, I remember, had started burning earlier in the day, but they were holding on. And then suddenly they just, you hit that threshold, or you've seen it in 24 hours plenty of times. Unlike a lot of other races, because everything's so repetitive, nothing ever changes. Once something stops working, it like tanks hard and fast. And so that's what happened to me. It was something like 22 hours until like I could barely walk, and I just sat down. And Ryan had also been having major issues like that. And he had slowed down so much that I'm like, there's no way he can catch me. Like I do too many of these things. I don't want to wreck myself and like be injured for another 6 months. I'm just going to call it. And so I literally sat down, and like he was doing something like 20 or 30 minutes a mile. And so I'm doing the math. I'm like, I'm safe. And then maybe an hour to go, he started just slowly increasing his pace. And, he's suddenly doing 18 minutes a mile and then 16 minutes a mile. And I'm watching lap over lap doing the math. And suddenly he crosses the threshold that if he goes this pace, I won't win. He'll pass me by the end. And so I'm like, I get up and I start just like stumbling around the track painfully, slowly. Like I was doing like a 60-minute mile or something. And then he starts picking up a little more. And I'm like, well, I got to pick up a little more to keep the lead. And so I pick up a little more. And then he picks up a little more. And then I do, until he's doing like sub 7 pace. I'm doing sub 8 pace, just trying to hold him off. He's trying to catch me. And we ended up just sprinting the last like 15 minutes or so.
Oh my goodness. I hope there's video of this, of
Oh,
just you
yeah.
guys. Like, I can see the evolution of just like the 30-minute mile to the 15 to the 9 to the 7.
Oh, yeah. I think I was already in the locker room sleeping at that point.
I would have just yelled across the track, like, Ryan, slow down. You guys should just, oh, that's got to be such a fun moment. Yeah, so I would love to talk a little bit about that 2021, our American record that you set. You've done this race before. What was different that year that led to this insane performance, setting the record? Do you give credit to your pacing strategy, your fueling approach? What do you think gave you the edge that year? Because you're so dialed in all of these aspects. And like you were talking about, it can come down to a pee break. It could come down to, okay, I'm going to take a little bit more sodium so I don't have to pee as much for a little bit, I guess maybe get inside your mind a little bit on this and kind of feel out what was that edge do you think that gave you that chance for the American record?
Yeah. So the idea for it started maybe a month after the 2020 race. And as I reflected on it, like I had that catastrophic blow up and I only ran like 0.4 miles further than my PR. So I ran like 155.4 instead of 155 flat from 2018. And looking at it though, I'm like, I was so good for like 16 hours. And like, what if I had just held that pace for 8 more hours and done a slight negative split again? And I think that put me somewhere like 165, 167. And so I'm like, well, maybe I can figure out the quad thing. And then maybe I can do a few other things to just strengthen up and then hold that pace. And then once I started thinking about, well, if I could run 167 and I could just train a little harder, maybe that starts switching up to 168, 169. And then, well, maybe I can figure out a few more little optimizations and get to 170. And then like, well, once you're in 170, like the American record's only 172.5. So maybe I can train a little harder, figure out if it's inch up. And then if I just push as hard as I can at the end, like maybe there's a world if you squint a whole lot that's not impossible. And like, I remember having this thought, I think in January, and I almost dismissed it immediately. And then it's like sitting there in the back of your head. And then you're like, well, I'll just start training and see what I can do. And like, think about things that I could do better and learn from the last time. Mm-hmm. And so I just rolled straight through 2020, started training, knowing like, I don't know if this is possible, but I'm just going to keep going that direction. And every single time during that year, I was doing this like daily or weekly, I would gut check, like, do I think I can actually hit this number, 172.5? And every time my thought was like, no, there's no way. Like, that's ridiculous. Like, I've run 155 and I'm trying to run 172.5. Like, that's an absurd increase to make that jump, even if all these things were to happen. And so I kept using that to fuel me saying, well, if I'm trying to get here, but I actually only feel like I'm here, I need to do more stuff to inch closer and closer. Mm-hmm. And so, week over week, month over month, I just kept deliberately training. I was running bigger and bigger races, all those training runs, all sub-maximal so I could roll through them, gain more fitness, figure out more logistics, try new things. And so I ran a 24-hour in May. I ran a 100-mile on a track in June. I was just training like I'd never trained before, keep doing everything to keep myself healthy, just building fitness and technique over and over again, experimenting, refining, getting all these little like sub% increases, like stacking little thing over thing. I was going to like deep sports psychology to figure out other barriers. I was like seeing a sports psychologist, trying to figure out the barriers of like, when do I go into my dark place? How do I not do that? Like, what other things can I do to just make sure everything goes right? Like, one of the ways I describe it is like, you talk about beginner ultra runners, and the mistake is they like expect everything to go right or hope for everything to go right. And experienced ultra runners plan for everything to go wrong. And I hit a phase where I started engineering everything to go right, such that like I had high confidence, exactly the pace I could run, exactly the failure modes that would come, exactly how to keep them off before they ever started. And so I just kept doing this throughout the whole year. I was putting in crazy miles on the track to get the specificity down, make sure my muscles weren't going to break down the way they had before. I was incorporating new training techniques. And so just thing after thing, I kept building closer and closer. And I remember 6 weeks out, I ran this 100K on the track. And I finished it in like 7:06. And it was like in the middle of super high training. And I remember finishing it and finally thinking, I think I might actually have a shot at this.
And then you ran a 50-mile race about 5 days later, if I remember.
Yeah, and that again only reinforced it because it was Sunday I did 100K, Saturday I ran Pass Mountain 50-mile in the mountains, and I negative split both of them pretty steadily, pretty confidently, and like that was trying to simulate like miles 80 to 130. Like there's no way to simulate mile 150 plus at that point, but I was trying to get further and further into that fatigue and build confidence that like my muscles will still work when I tell them to. My quads aren't going to burn out. My stomach's not going to give out. All these other things, I'm fully in control. I'm not getting sloppy. I'm not getting too tired. That I kept getting more and more muscle memory around when I get late in this race, I'm going to know exactly what to do. It's going to feel familiar, not unknown. And when it came to the race, that's essentially exactly what it did. Like I remember feeling basically the same through like 110, 120 miles. So like, I'm just jogging out here. I feel like I'm not racing yet. I'm completely in control. And like probably starting 16 hours, like that, I kept telling myself even before, 16 hours is actually where the race starts. And nothing matters before then. I'm not trying to do anything. I'm just holding a certain pace. It's the pace on paper that I have to run. And I'm not even going to expend any energy until 16 hours. And then I only have to do 8 hours, which is something that I've done constantly in training or much more. And so that's all I really had to focus on. And really, I only have to focus on the last 4 hours because 8 to 4 hours still isn't that bad. Yeah, and the last 4 hours, I remember thinking I hit 20 hours. Jamil had just showed up because he'd been off doing the live stream, and he got there to the venue, and I just started yelling at him because I'm like, what's going on? I was certain I was going to blow up at every step, and so I was still very focused on like keeping everything, doing it right. Like I knew that I could lose it at any moment, and at that, like I was still below record pace. I had to keep speeding up 4 hours to go to get it. And I only got it with 3 minutes out of 24 hours remaining. So there was literally no room for any mistake. But I really, I tried to add up. I don't think I lost more than a couple minutes the entire race. And certainly all those little things, probably dozens or 100 of them, added up to saving, I don't know, an hour or two over the course of it. And yeah, it was just the perfect day.
Yeah, I remember that race. Nick had pink shoes on, if I remember. And I just remember this guy is like a metronome. He just literally, it seemed like his pace just never faltered all day. It's one of those moments, again, I am so grateful that I was just there to be on the track with you. And I mean, you have obviously helped shape my career. I always, ask you for advice. We got one last question for you, Nick. You obviously have the American record. You had the person that put on Desert Solstice. In years to come, are we going to see Nick Coury back on that track trying to re-break that American record?
I think about it every year. I love the event. I love the format so much that I want to come back again. The other side of it is, especially going into that, I remember putting a lot of thought into what happens if I actually do break this thing. And my worry was it would never be enough. Seeing too many athletes run into that, and you do it, and then you need to find always the next thing, and then you end up running into trouble just endlessly pursuing it. And so I really, this is something I never had as a lifetime goal. It's so far beyond it that I was blown away that I could achieve that, and I'm pretty satisfied with it. And so if I never came back to it, I think I'd be happy. But at the same time, I love seeing what I can do. I always want to see if I can push further. So no guarantees, but I wouldn't be surprised if I'm back.
Oh, yeah, with ultras, you can never say never, because even, a year or two after a race and you're still, having thoughts about the race and flashbacks. I know I am about a couple races, but never say never.
Awesome. Nick, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us. We hope you see you this year in some capacity at Solstice. And good luck with your training, buddy.
Yeah, thanks. I'll see you there.
See ya.